Hello, and welcome to the Library Company's Fireside Chat for October. My name is Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am delighted to welcome you for this month's Fireside Chat, which is with Casey Schmitt to discuss her excellent new book, The Predatory Sea, the Human Trafficking and Captivity in the 17th Century Caribbean. Before we get started, I want to make a couple announcements about some upcoming events at the Library Company. I am in front of a picture of the Library Company as it existed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There is a building today on the same spot in Philadelphia that is a reproduction, but this was originally the Library Company of Philadelphia. And the Library Company to this day is an organization that relies on the community to be what it is. So you can participate in the Library Company's future by being a financial supporter and becoming even a shareholder. So I urge you to check that out. The Library Company, like all other cultural and scholarly endeavors, needs all the support it can get in the current climate. And we have some very exciting events coming up. I want to mention that on November 5th, we will be hosting an event called Rum and Coffee. This will be two authors gathering to talk about their books. We're staying in the Caribbean for this. It will be Michelle Craig McDonald talking about her book that just came out this year, Coffee Nation: How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. And she will be joined by Jordan Smith, whose book has just come out right now, The Invention of Rum, Creating the Quintessential Atlantic Commodity. And to celebrate the combination of rum and coffee, we are hosting a reception beforehand for shareholders or for people who want to pay to participate as well, where we will be having lots of treats with rum and coffee. Then on November 20th, we'll have our next fireside chat. This one is not hosted by the Program in Early American Economy and Society, which is what this one is. And so I'm not hosting it, but it will be someone named Jamie Brummett, the author is Jamie Brummett, talking about their book, Protestant Relics in Early America. And then Peas is back in December, on December 9th. We will be hosting Travis Glasson for a discussion of his new book, which just came out this summer, called, it's hard for the screen to find it, called Nobody Men: Neutrality, Loyalties, and Family in the American Revolution. So that should be a lot of fun. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Casey Schmitt, who is historian extraordinaire of early America and the Caribbean. She received her BA from Arizona State University, her MA from the University of Utah, and her PhD from the College of William and Mary, an alma mater that we share. She is on the faculty of Cornell University and has particular interests in the history of human trafficking, colonization, and illicit economies over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. She has received numerous honors and accolades, and I would like to mention the one that is how I got to meet her, which is that she was the Barra Postdoctoral Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies for 2 years. She is a very busy citizen of the scholarly community. When you read her acknowledgments, it's just breathtaking how many people she is connected to and on whose expertise she is drawn to create this amazing book. In addition to all of these other commitments, she is also serving on the inaugural Peas Advisory Council and giving me good help as we think about how to make the program give some life and vigor to the program in early American economy and society. So I am very grateful to you, Casey, for that. Her first book, which is what we're going to talk about today, is again The Predatory Sea, and it is just out, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press this fall. I forget what the release date was, but I mean, we're talking like a month. It's quite new. And it is the first full-length study of the deeply entangled histories of captivity and colonialism in the 16th and 17th century Caribbean. So welcome, Casey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, and thank you especially to Fran and Grace for organizing everything, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk about my book. I'm really, really honored to be part of this series. So thought I would start by putting the book in a little bit of context. As you said, it came out a month ago, so I'm sure people have not had a chance to read it. And I'll just do that quickly because I'm really looking forward to the questions and to hear your thoughts and your questions on the book, Jess. So I'll share a PowerPoint. Okay. Uh, Okay. So again, thank you so much. I want to lay out, as I said, the kind of research question, where the book came from, how I came to this project, and how the questions I was asking when I first started research for this book changed with the archival sources that I encountered. I'm going to lay out kind of quickly the arguments of the chapters and the key interventions as I see them, again, because I don't assume that anyone has had time to read it. But so I sort of wanted to start by just saying that as I write in the preface to the book, this project had many false starts from the early research for my dissertation to the final book. The origins of this project was what I thought of as, at the time, a simple research question. Basically, I wanted to know if the Spanish had established the institution of slavery in the Americas over a century before the English and French established their own colonies, specifically in the Caribbean, but widely in the Americas. I wanted to know if that influenced how and why the English and French adopted slavery in their own colonies, again, specifically in the Caribbean. I was sort of wondering, in other words, if the Spanish or Portuguese precedents influenced subsequent European empires in the Americas and the practice of exploiting enslaved labor in English and French colonies. I had decided on this project to start in the Caribbean because I assumed that the geographic proximity between Spanish, French, and English colonies would have facilitated more legal borrowing across imperial borders. And I'll just sort of get up a map of the space that we'll be talking about today. So as I approached this project with those research questions in mind, I went to the English, French, and Spanish archives, both in Europe and in the Caribbean and different archival repositories in North America. But my thinking as I approached the archives had been shaped by a Caribbean historiography that tended, in the moment that I was coming out of graduate school or, doing my research in graduate school, the historiography tended to be dominated by studies of the 18th century plantation sugar, or the sugar plantation complex, excuse me. Now, that scholarly emphasis on the 18th century and on the sugar plantation complex was not without reason, of course. The widespread adoption of slave-based plantation agriculture really transformed islands like Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, transformed those islands into the wealthiest colonies of the British and French empires, but also into shockingly brutal places where the industrial production of sugar killed enslaved Africans and their descendants at appalling rates. So when I was in graduate school, books like Vincent Brown's The Reaper's Garden had a real impact on the questions I was trying to answer in the archives. Um, a lot of the historiography, I thought at the time, had sort of treated earlier centuries, the 16th and the 17th centuries, as more of a prelude to the 18th century. So sort of using those earlier centuries to explain the origins of this particularly brutal 18th century world. So my original research question reflected this tendency. I approached the 16th and 17th centuries expecting to find evidence of the social and legal origins of the societies of the 18th century Caribbean. I expected to find evidence of the process by which English and French colonists learned or developed practices of exploiting enslaved people by mimicking pre-existing Spanish and Portuguese models in the Caribbean and Brazil. I also expected to find evidence of legal borrowing through which the English and French created potentially legal statutes or codes to reinforce racialized slavery by drawing on Iberian precedents. And I assumed that islands like Barbados, Jamaica, or Saint Domingue, Hispaniola on this map, the western part of Hispaniola, I assumed that those islands would provide the most archival evidence since race-based plantation agriculture assumed its most productive and brutal form in those spaces. Now, none of those expectations bore themselves out, especially when I started working in Spain's Archivo General de Indias, the colonial repository for the Spanish Empire. I did not in these sources encounter a process whereby the English and French gradually turned to slavery as a result of plantation agriculture. Rather, I found evidence of an immediate engagement on the part of ship captains, mariners, and merchants with slavery that even predated English and French colonization in the Caribbean. Nor did the geographic concerns of the Spanish sources seem to fit what I expected. I'll go back to this map for just a second. Islands that tend not to garner much attention in the secondary literature, specifically about the 18th century, largely because they failed to become wealth-producing sort of sugar behemoths in the 18th century. These islands appeared again and again in Spanish sources. So places like St. Christopher, Tortuga, and Providencia really, in the sources I was reading, preoccupied Spanish officials and seemed to be important islands for 16th and 17th century English and French sailors, ship captains, and eventually metropolitan officials interested in investing in colonies. So the archival sources, in other words, did not add up to what I had expected, and it convinced me, maybe too late in the process, but it worked out, to start with what those sources were actually saying, what they were actually describing, rather than what I had assumed I would find in them. And one thing kept coming up over and over again in the Spanish archival sources that I read about the 16th and 17th century Caribbean. So throughout the letters and reports, like documents like this one, from the 16th and 17th century Spanish Caribbean, I encountered testimonies that centered on experiences of captivity and human trafficking. So those testimonies came from both captives and their captors, African and indigenous inhabitants of the Spanish Caribbean, free and enslaved, attested or testified over again to being seized from ships during raids on coastal communities, port towns, and inland settlements. Their captors, often these sort of multinational companies of European traffickers, transported them away from their communities of belonging in order to profit off of selling them into slavery elsewhere. So I encountered testimonies about this experience that also pointed to the fact that prior to the 1620s, those captives were often sold into slavery in commercially underserved parts of the Spanish Caribbean. And after the 1620s, English, French, and Dutch colonies became common destinations. So some people, of course, liberated themselves from captivity through marinage, escaping to neighboring islands, and self-liberated captives who escaped to Spanish Caribbean islands testified before officials on those islands about their experiences, providing what turned out to be a really rich archival record of captivity over this century of Caribbean history. So captors, too, left archival traces of their activities when the Spanish took the occasional prisoner following thwarted raids or attempts at trade. Now, under interrogation, traffickers described the nature of what I began to think of as slaving practices involving captive taking and human trafficking that looked very different from the sort of more formalized transatlantic slave trade and intra-Caribbean slave trades and the plantation complex of the 18th century. So testimonies that at first seemed kind of extraordinary and hard to square with the secondary literature began to look kind of disturbingly unremarkable the more I read in the Spanish colonial archives. Now, that realization was the spark of the book. So I should say that Spanish colonial archives are not the usual repository for historians of the English or French Caribbean. But when read alongside English and French manuscript sources, and especially alongside the really robust historiography being produced by historians of the Spanish Caribbean, reading those documents against all of these other sources revealed to me what I began to think of as a deeply entangled 16th and 17th century Caribbean world in which subjects of different monarchs, Africans and their descendants, and indigenous populations interacted, conducted business, formed alliances, fought, raided, and occasionally took one another captive. And I argue in the book that taken in the aggregate, those interactions were formative for English and French colonial development in the Caribbean during the 17th century. That experience shaped where and how those colonies and the subsequent trade in enslaved people throughout the Caribbean developed over the century that I study in the book. So rather than a book that shows the origins of the 18th century sugar plantation complex, in other words, the book that I ended up writing traces how the Caribbean was, in essence, a complex, dynamic world defined by unfreedom well before the 18th century. Perhaps more importantly, I began to think of my book as not a prehistory to that 18th century world. Rather, my focus became on the experiences and perspectives of people whose lives traversed the Caribbean by choice or coercion between 1570 and 1670. It is, I think, in other words, a book about the historical strategies of specific people, captors, and their captives in the context of a particular moment. So I show how opportunism, marginality, and vulnerability shaped the choices of individual actors across this century. Now, to be sure, the consequences of those choices would influence the development of the 18th century Caribbean. But I, in this book, really work to center the slaving strategies of captives and the responses of their captives in order to reveal a world that I think can sometimes be overshadowed by what comes next. Now, one of the key interventions, and then I'll finish here pretty quickly, that I try to make in the book is related to the nature of early English and French Caribbean colonization. So scholars have tended to analyze the process of English and French colonization from the perspective of a single empire, often emphasizing the development of a single island at the expense of inter-island and regional connections. And there are important exceptions to that, to be sure. This book, in fact, builds on recent scholarship that explicitly de-emphasizes English and French imperial perspectives in favor of portraying the Caribbean as an interconnected space defined by entanglements, again, between Europeans, Africans, and indigenous populations. So this approach, I think, offers a view of Caribbean colonization, in essence, from the bottom up, built not as a result of imperial planning, but really from these sort of petty individual financial decisions made by a really multi-ethnic assortment of people. I show how traffickers occupied and integrated Caribbean spaces into networks of cross-cultural trade centered around captivity and slavery decades before their respective monarchs issued licenses for the establishment of official colonies. As the book shows, the earliest English and French island colonies in the Caribbean developed because of those islands' place in networks of captive taking and human trafficking, which predated the imperial plans of officials in England or France. So I will leave it there, and hopefully this will put us all a bit on the same page about where the project came from and what I think the main interventions are. And I look forward to the questions.
Sorry, my computer wouldn't unmute. Thank you so much, Casey. And one of the things I appreciated about your presentation just there, in addition to really setting up what the book does and some of how you came into it in the first place with what you thought was a simple question and turned out 10 years later, you know, to be like this big project that has all these threads. that pull out in ways that you never expected. But I also just appreciated the map that you put up. I will say, I don't think I said this to you when we talked earlier. I really appreciated the maps in your book. They're very well done.
Yeah.
And they're very helpful. As someone who is not a Caribbeanist, I really appreciated, and I felt like one of the things your book does so well is walk me around chronologically around the Caribbean in a way that I feel like I understand the Eastern Caribbean and the Western Caribbean and then, sort of different parts of the Caribbean in finer detail than I had ever understood them before. So that is one of the many strengths of your book.
I have a
So
really amazing map maker. If anybody needs maps, please reach out to me. So,
excellent. So that wasn't through the press. That's someone you know.
yeah, that's an independent map maker. Yeah.
Well, they did a wonderful job. Um, so I wanted to start by asking you, it's a word that's in your title. I wanted to ask why you use the word trafficker, human trafficker in your throughout the book. What meaning that has for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one that I came to actually quite late in the project. And in part, it was the discomfort with using what I think of as sort of imperial labels for maritime predation that have a lot to do with the perspective of specific empires. And so part of it is because the book traces this period from 1570 to 1670, the labels that empires use to describe pirates, for example, change over time. So I had noticed that initially my chapters were using corsair, then it switched to buccaneer, then it switched to privateer, then it switched to pirate. And I had a hard time squaring the fact that essentially what I found all of these same actors doing across a century of history was essentially making a voyage through taking people captive and trafficking them into slavery, right? And I realized that the work that those other labels was doing was to, in fact, sort of bury this more violent history and bury the ways in which smuggling and piracy in this period really depended on captive taking in order to sort of make a profit from voyages. And, in this way, I really built on Gregory O'Malley's book, right, where he, in the early chapters of his book, sort of argues that, in fact, having captive people became the way to engage in informal trade. And I wanted to use traffickers in a provocative sense that forces us to think about what they were actually doing
Mhm.
rather than sort of how empires were defining the legality or illegality of their behavior. But not without sort of intending to be a little provocative with the terms. And it's true that, of course, there was a lot of maritime predation that didn't involve taking people captive, but the group of people that I am looking at, this is the primary mode in which they made profit from their voyages and engaged in informal trade.
Well, and as you say, one of the major points that your book emphasizes so well, so clearly, is how that trafficking in humans facilitated so much else in terms of imperial trade and all the other kinds of trade that there might be. It's often having people who are available for considered to be enslavable and available for that market is what greases all the rest of it. And that does segue into O'Malley's book, which is you sort of begin by the end of your book, we're getting to the very beginning of the asiento, the Spanish asiento, which is the when the Spanish crown gave a grant to a pair of merchants to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish markets, and that asiento is sort of an early part of where Greg picks up. So you've got the where you end is kind of where he picks up, which
Yeah.
works out nicely. You used a phrase in answering me just now. You said to make a voyage, which I might think I understand what that means, but having read your book, I know that you actually have a very particular meaning with that phrase. I want to make sure that our listeners understand what you mean.
Yeah, no. So this is a phrase that I came across a lot in English and French archival sources in particular, and a little bit actually in Spanish sources when mariners were taken captive and interrogated by Spanish officials. But it's essentially the language that they would use to describe the process of bringing back a profit to pay back the merchants who had invested in their voyages. So, especially starting in the mid 16th century, there were a lot of these merchant finance syndicates in Western Europe that would essentially just equip ships for a whole range of activities in the Caribbean, including smuggling, maritime raiding, obviously human trafficking, and they would sort of discuss their activities in the terms of needing to make a voyage. In other words, needing to return to Europe with some kind of return on the investment that merchants had given them to outfit their ships.
And you do a wonderful job showing how making a voyage looks in, say, the 1570s, and where if you are from the Northern European, so Spain considers the Caribbean to be theirs. It's mare clausum, it's closed seas, it's theirs, no one else is supposed to be there, but they don't have the capacity actually ever to keep interlopers out, and they are finding sanctuary early on, in communities that they're then using as toeholds. And you show how the process there then of making a voyage for those interlopers looks in the 1570s. What would you say are some of the big pivot points? Like if we start in the 1570s when they're first starting to do this, where are they going in, say, 1570? How does it change by about 1630? Like what are some of the big changes over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that I actually didn't understand fully until pretty far into writing the book. But so I think one of the ways to think about this is actually around the pivot of about the 1630s. So prior to
Mm.
the 1630s and prior to official, especially English and French colonies in the Caribbean, many of the mariners who are entering this space are finding, as you say, these kinds of toeholds, these safe anchorages in different parts of the Caribbean, in part because, maritime technology in this period, ships needed to be careened every 6 months or they wouldn't be seaworthy. They needed to refresh their water, they needed wood, they needed foodstuffs. And so, in order to keep this process of maritime predation going in the Caribbean, and sometimes they'd be in the Caribbean for a year or two at a time in order to make their voyage. In order to do this, they needed safe spaces where they could do ship repair and get supplies. And so prior to 1630, that happened largely through these cross-cultural trade alliances with either indigenous communities in especially the Lesser Antilles, so Kalinago populations in the Lesser Antilles that had maintained their autonomy and their sovereignty from Spanish entradas. So they would find allies in the Lesser Antilles and trade in the Lesser Antilles with Kalinago populations in exchange for these safe anchorages. Many of these traffickers would also go to places like Tortuga and Caimito, which are these tiny islands off the western tip of Hispaniola. Some were even going as far as Providencia, but they were all spaces that were either sort of protected because they were kind of peripheral from Spanish imperial authority, because there were populations that had maintained their autonomy, or even in a lot of cases from Spanish Caribbean communities themselves that were on the kind of outskirts of Spain's official trade system. So access to trade for them would be more expensive and more difficult. And then after 1630, with the establishment of official English, French, and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, there's less of a dependence on these sort of safe anchorages. And so what happens after this period is former trade allies, in fact, become subject to raiding themselves because English, French, and Dutch traffickers have markets, new colonial markets to engage in, and ports where they could refit their ships. So there really is these kind of like shifting strategies that also shift who was vulnerable to captivity and in what ways.
Yeah, you really show a very fluid world, no pun intended, in the earlier period where at one moment a community might be a safe haven, for a human trafficker, and the next, and even might be someone that they're bringing enslaved people to, and then the next moment they themselves are subject potentially to raiding. And it's really reinforced for me in a way, or I shouldn't say reinforced, I think really opened to me in a way I hadn't appreciated before, the importance of a tiny community like St. Christopher's, this island that is populated by both a French and an English colony simultaneously, which makes it kind of unstable and self-competitive. The importance of that first British, or I should say English, excuse me, colony in the Caribbean and the ripples of that change for the geopolitical context and the political economy for human trafficking for the whole region. Because then they have a place, it's a different kind of dynamic that then expands as they start to have stable colonial ventures in other places. So it's that really helped me understand English colonization, English imperial reach, and what that meant to the changing fortunes of what it's like to live in the Caribbean tremendously.
Yeah.
Another question, so pivoting actually past that, or actually, I guess I should say earlier. So the 1630s, pointing my pen at you, the 1630s is a major pivot point. And then there's another later in the 1660s, which we should come back to. But I want to take us to something that you talk about in your conclusion, which is a date that more North American historians will be very familiar with, which is 1619. And you do mention at the end, this voyage of a Dutch ship arriving in Jamestown. It has captured 20 odd human beings, Africans, who from a Portuguese transatlantic slave ship, and is brought and brings them to Jamestown. And this is seen as such an important moment in American history. And you're not trying to quarrel with that, but you are asking us to see it in another context. Can you explain?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm certainly not quarreling with the importance of paying attention to 1619, but part of what I hope the book can do is actually put 1619 into its Caribbean context,
Mhm.
and to think about the ways in which an event that has been seen as, I think, kind of singular and a kind of starting point is part of its much longer, deeper history in the Caribbean. And I also sort of wanted to use 1619 in the conclusion to engage in a conversation about the ways in which understandings of sort of racialization and vulnerability change over the course of my project. And so one of the, I think, more difficult historiographical challenges of this book was how to think about racialization, as a process that becomes sort of formalized in the late 17th century, right? That actually the ship captains that I study in the 16th century are very aware of the vulnerability of certain racialized populations to human trafficking. But they don't see all people always as vulnerable to human trafficking. And so I kind of wanted to bring 1619 in the conclusion to think about, again, this sort of longer history that the kind of slavery doesn't sort of begin in 1619 in Virginia in that way, but in fact is sort of these ideas and practices are fermenting in the Caribbean in really formative ways.
I want to mention we're starting to get some questions populated into our Q&A line, which is awesome. Please keep them going. We're going to keep talking for a little bit longer, and we're going to move to Q&A in the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation. But if you've got questions, please, by all means, be throwing them in there. Um, so, so just to finish sort of the pivot points of change over time, 1570s when you start to see the rise of these Northern European interlopers coming in and the way that they are trying to get their hands on the commodities of the Caribbean and finding that trading enslaved people into communities is a good way to get food and water and safe harbor. It's a good way to get the dye woods that they're after and the other commodities that are starting to be important. Turtles and I mean all kinds of products that one is not used to thinking about being important. Tobacco, another early one. Um, but this all starts to change in the 1630s for various reasons, but part of it is that the French and the English and eventually the Dutch will start to have actual colonies in the Caribbean where they have safe haven, which means that they rely less on indigenous and Afro-descended maroon communities for sustenance and help. But we see another big pivot in the 1660s. What's happening then?
Yeah, so the last two chapters are really about what I started to think of as a kind of formalization of these pre-existing practices. So in 1662, the merchants who get access to the Asiento contract, who sign the Asiento contract with Spain, Grillo and Lomelin, essentially also they changed the nature of how Asiento holders had conducted the trade in captive people to Spanish America. So previous to the 1660s, previous holders of the Asiento would essentially conduct the transatlantic portion of the slave trade. So the sort of trade on the Atlantic African coast and the transportation of captives across the Atlantic. And these Genoese merchants really changed the nature of that trade and instead sort of subcontract English and Dutch monopoly slave trading companies so that they are purchasing enslaved captives in the Caribbean. And this is, there's some really great work on this process, but one of the arguments that I wanted to make in the book, in fact, is that that practice of purchasing enslaved captives in the Caribbean was not an innovation of Grillo and Lomelin. They're actually responding to the ways in which the trade had been functioning in the Caribbean for the 30 to 40 years before the formalization of the trade. And I think almost as much as all of the chapters, this is a moment where the consequences for West and West Central Africans and their descendants in the Caribbean is really important, in part because one of the cases that I trace in the last chapter of the book involves individuals who had been taken captive from throughout the Spanish Caribbean, sold into slavery in Jamaica. These individuals then escaped to Spanish Cuba. And rather than, there's a sort of long historiography, excellent historiography on the ways in which the Spanish offered freedom in exchange for baptism, the argument that individuals who escaped from Protestant islands to Spanish islands would be granted their freedom. Except what I found with this group was that many of them had been free before they had been taken captive. And in fact, their maritime mobility gets sort of tangled up in this juridical process in which one of the judges working for these Asiento holders claims them as property of the Asiento. And so it's not at all a chapter intending to discount the practice of freedom in exchange for baptism, but it is a chapter where I try to argue that for specific individuals in this moment, maritime mobility, Blackness and maritime mobility really get wedded to slavery in ways that make it very difficult for people who were formerly free to argue for and defend their free status.
It's a really interesting chapter. Like I having the representative of the Asiento merchants they're able to say, well, there's you give a long story around this one incident of a man who had been a Spanish man who had been captured and was being held in prison in Jamaica, and how they all get away. A group of enslaved people free him and use him to pilot the ship 400 nautical miles, if I'm remembering the distance right, to get to where did they go? I'm forgetting now.
They go to Cuba.
Cuba. And once they get there, the question is he bringing people in the process that you're describing, or is he himself a trafficker, in which case all of these people belong to the Asiento by the rules of the Asiento. So it's this very interesting moment, but it's not the kind of story I'm used to in terms of how race gets made through legal codes and all that. It's a very different story of working out claims to freedom and enslavability based on prior histories. Like it's a very different kind of story. I want to get at one other point before we open it up to questions, though. Um, again, like you thought you were starting with a really simple question when you started working on the research of this book. What did slavery look like, or what, sort of what are the precursors of slavery in the Caribbean before, say, 1640? Because none of the dates that we've used, by the way, have been sugar dates. We have not been discussing, which is really typically that story starts in the 1640s and is ramping up by the 1660s and is in full throttle by the 1680s. And it's a story around the movement of Dutch planters and their expertise, and sort of that's a very different story than the one that you've been telling. And the story, if you focus on sugar, the story is that the labor system created the demand for labor. Once sugar was in place, the capacity of indentured servitude to supply the intense labor needs of sugar required, well, it didn't require, they made a choice, but um, they chose another kind of labor system. They chose to turn to chattel slavery and invent a very new form of slavery. And if anything, they're borrowing from Madeira and the Azores, from plantation systems that had been first worked out in those spaces in the decades before. But your story is very different. Your story is not a labor system in search of labor. It's more like a trafficking system that uses labor as a commodity that then creates the demand. Like the supply actually predates the demand in your story. Is that at all what you expected?
Yeah, no, no, not at all. And in part, I think, and I don't want, I don't see my work as sort of countering any of the scholarship on the rise of the plantation complex, and the ways in which the slave trade and sugar planters, the kind of mutual development of those two things. And I actually took a lot from Holly Brewer's work recently, where she makes a really compelling argument about how the period that I'm talking about, the period before the 1670s, the 1660s, is really a period in which a lot of this trafficking can happen. Because of the nature of captive taking, that individuals essentially trafficked captives into colonial markets in exchange for goods. As you said,
Mm.
there's really an emphasis on tobacco, on dyewoods, on things like this that are happening sort of in these kind of marketplace transactions. And Holly Brewer makes a really compelling argument about how this becomes less feasible when you have monopoly slave trading companies that are having to invest a ton of capital into maintaining forts in Atlantic Africa and conducting this trade, right? And so this kind of the increase in scale to a certain extent creates the need for the codification or the sort of legal apparatus that we think of as essential for the plantation complex. My argument is not to counter that at all, but it is to sort of say that English, French, and Dutch, to a certain extent, peoples in the Caribbean had grappled with these questions of racialization since the 1570s, earlier in some cases, and that essentially what I want to argue is to actually create, to sort of, as I said earlier, make 1630 more of an important pivot point in terms of how the traffickers that I'm looking at are thinking about vulnerability, right?
Mhm.
That the ways in which that they'd always understood populations as racialized because there was a market for certain peoples in the Spanish Caribbean itself, but that not all populations were vulnerable to captivity at all moments, right? That these cross-cultural alliances were possible even in a Caribbean environment. I found this was at the John Carter Brown Library, and I will always be grateful to this library for this find. But I found a document that was describing Pierre Blanc de Nembu, who's the first official French governor in the Caribbean. He becomes the governor of one of the French quarters of Saint Christopher, Saint Christophe. And he, before he becomes royal governor, was in fact involved in raiding for captives along the Spanish Main. He's in a consort with a Dutch ship and an English ship. So it's, a Dutch, an English, and a French ship. They raid for captives along the Spanish Main. And the captives that they're seizing are peoples of African and indigenous descent. But their trade partners in this pre-1630s moment, his raid actually happens in 1621 and 1622. Their trade partners are African Maroon communities in Western Hispaniola. And so I wanted to think about the ways in which, I sort of wanted to think about the ways in which traffickers sort of understood racialized vulnerability that didn't always in every circumstance mean enslavability. And
Mhm.
that to sort of position the development of colonies as, in fact, a moment in which these opportunities for cross-cultural alliances really start to erode.
Well, I think it's fascinating. And again, I wasn't trying to imply that we're trying to overthrow the sugar story, but to say that to understand what was happening in the Caribbean before that is to understand that processes of captive taking and trafficking long predate sugar, and it long predates plantation slavery because they are engaged in a whole host of maritime activities and island economy activities. Again, turtling and logwood and some tobacco cultivation, fishing and moving around. I mean, it's just all kinds of activities that they are engaged in that, but the practices are kind of what's greasing the wheels for when slavery really does become such a large scale endeavor later in the 17th century, a lot of work has already happened to make that possible, both in terms of commerce, but also intellectually and socially, at least in the minds of the European traffickers who are doing it.
Yeah.
So I think we're just scratching the surface here, but I want to open the questions to our audience. So we have an anonymous attendee who says, I wondered how far these traffickers sailed to sell these captives, obviously around the Caribbean colonies, but any toward North America and emerging Virginia and Massachusetts, a bit later the Carolinas. And so I think they asked that before we had talked about the Virginia example. So we know that at least in one case they go to Virginia. What else can you tell us?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And in fact, it's a little bit, so the second project, I'm really wanting to do a lot more work knitting the North American story with this Caribbean story. But there's trade all the time. So one of the central moments in the book, in fact, in chapter 4, I discuss this period between basically 1629 and 1653 in which the Spanish raid and in some cases raid twice different English and French islands because they're these sort of centers of trafficking. And Providencia becomes one of the islands that's sort of the center of Spanish raids. And a lot of people have written about this. Allison Games has an excellent article about this. George Clay, who has a really excellent dissertation about this. It becomes the center of Spanish attention, in fact, because it becomes a main base for Northern European traffickers in the 1630s. And a lot of enslaved captives from Providencia are being sold in Virginia. So that's one sort of moment in which there's an active trade between the Caribbean and North America. The other moment where this comes up is during the English invasion of Spanish Jamaica. And so during the course of the invasion, I've come across, I discuss in the book several moments in which traffickers take captives and sell them into Jamaica, or
Mhm,
excuse me, into slavery in Virginia. So there are
mhm.
these moments, of course, where the trade is sort of going towards North America, but it's something that I think needs a lot more work actually to understand the depths of ties. And it's something that I hope to do a little bit more of.
Well, and you may not want to do this in your second project, but I noticed you described, for example, a woman who was from Pernambuco in Brazil. So it's also there. I would imagine there are connections that move north, but there are also plenty of connections that would move in to the south and to Venezuela. Well, you talk about Venezuela a fair amount. So it's It's connecting North America, South America, as you might expect, from the Caribbean um, center.
Yeah.
Okay, here is a question from Helen Kilburn.
Okay.
Thank you for introducing your book. I am looking forward to reading it. Please, can you give your thoughts on whether the changes in ideas about sovereignty caused by the 30 Years' War change approaches to legal personhood, subjecthood in the Caribbean around the 1630s, and human traffickers are also influencing debates in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah. That's another. Yeah, I mean, I don't engage as much with this question in the book. I will say that part of how the 30 Years' War actually comes into the book are individuals who are themselves war captives, and many of whom get trafficked into indentured servitude in Europe or in the Caribbean in this period. So I follow two prisoners, in fact, who end up getting trafficked into indentured servitude in St. Kitts and in Tortuga. But I don't, this question of how this environment of human trafficking is influencing debates in Europe is not something that I necessarily found really compelling connections for. And this was one of the difficult things about writing the project. Working from a Caribbean perspective that sort of de-emphasizes empires is the work of kind of constructing a chronology and connecting these spaces sort of left me very Caribbean focused.
Mhm.
I think in productive ways, right? Because I think this sort of forced me to think about essentially what people were actually doing in this space rather than how people were talking about the space, how they were imagining the space. But it does mean that I paid less attention to debates in Europe, but there's certainly a kind of trafficking of captives from Europe because of the 30 Years' War into the Caribbean spaces.
That was actually one of the moments that really surprised me. You describe a Frenchman who is captured by another Frenchman, so they're not different nations or religions, and he is trafficked into technically indentured servitude, but as you point out, without any protections to make sure that your contract ends at a certain point, it could just be, in fact, slavery. And I don't know much that we talked earlier, you and I separately from this conversation about the disease environment, how many of these people are surviving past the term of indentured servitude. But at any rate, sort of the surprise of how finding laboring bodies of a variety of types, including your co-French, co-religionist, into slavery in the Caribbean is perfectly plausible in this moment and in the sort of vulnerability of a whole host of people. Not
Yeah,
to equate what happened to him to chattel slavery, but
yeah,
to think about sort of the fluidity of how they are approaching all kinds of people and throwing them into labor
yeah.
in this moment.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting, one of the moments in which this becomes less possible is, of course, the 1650s and 1660s in the Lesser Antilles and even in the Western Caribbean, in part because what becomes very clear in the Lesser Antilles and the Western Caribbean is a desire to engage in sort of, a kind of diplomatic relationship between islands under the control of different empires. So there's a case I talk about the fisherman, in fact, that you mentioned, who was held prisoner in Jamaica. The traffickers who took him captive attempted to sell him into indentured servitude in Jamaica, but the governor intervened. And so, what I noticed in the archival documents is starting in about the 1650s through to the end of my project, the kind of flexibility around exploiting the labor of, indentured servants, captives without contracts, really stops. And it stops because, in this case, the Jamaican governor is attempting to essentially negotiate to engage in the intra-Caribbean slave trade with neighboring Spanish governors and doesn't want this kind of diplomatic row. In other cases in the Lesser Antilles, there are moments in which, for example, a French governor will approach an English governor about signing treaties of restitution, right? So the idea that they could control or attempt to control the maritime mobility of captives who use this aqueous environment to self-liberate themselves from slavery, that they would essentially sign treaties of restitution in which individuals individuals who escaped from one island to another would be returned. And so there's a much more attention after the 1650s on making sure that that kind of exploiting the labor of captive Europeans doesn't happen anymore in the same way.
Yeah. All right. One last question from our audience for now. There might be, oh no, excuse me, two more. Dr. Schmitt, how have you approached Indigenous perspectives narratives in this work? Is there a change between the way they interacted with the Spanish, Portuguese, and the British and French?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've been very fortunate in the fact that I have a whole host of really excellent historiography to build off of in this project, especially for the Kalinago. There's quite a bit of work that's been done, most recently by Tessa Murphy in her book, The Creole Archipelago. I also, especially for thinking about the Kalinago, used a lot of linguistic evidence, so read dictionaries to try to think about the language that they were using specifically to describe traffickers. And there's a kind of term that gets developed that it translated literally means like he who puts one in chains, right? So I tried to think about their perspective on this trade through linguistic evidence. And, you know, it's interesting, depending on where you look, thinking about this question of their interaction with the Spanish versus the English or the French, especially if you focus on the Kalinago. This was initially a relationship of kind of mutual benefit. The Kalinago had maintained their autonomy from Spanish entradas or Spanish slave raids into the Lesser Antilles, and had really carved out a space that was kind of beyond Spanish control. And so the arrival of Northern Europeans to trade things like iron implements and tools and weapons was really beneficial to the Kalinago. In fact, I argue in the second chapter that part of the quote unquote success of the first English colony actually depends, I think, on a kind of misunderstanding, right? Where the Kalinago leader, King Tegraman, essentially allows Thomas Warner and the English to establish a camp. But he allowed them to establish a camp along the terms that had been pre-existing with traffickers for decades. So Tegraman was used to European traffickers coming and careening their ships, getting supplies, doing things like that. And in fact, you know, probably would, you know, certainly would not have reacted positively to the arrival of quote unquote colonists in the same way. So part of it, thinking about these anchorages that traffickers are able to use, is thinking about these populations like the Kalinago, who had a particular relationship, pre-existing relationship with the Spanish in the Caribbean that then traffickers kind of interact with, I guess, if that answers that question.
Yeah. Well, we are almost out of time. The last question, maybe out of our ambit, it's a question about a family that engaged in the slave trade in support of their rum production, but I think that might be temporally beyond your book. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, it's a little bit temporally beyond my book, although I do recommend looking at Jordan Smith's book
Right.
that today was published. I think he would have some answers certainly on
Wait,
that.
is today the what?
I think today's the publication day.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
If I'm wrong, I apologize, but I think it's today.
Well, as I say, if you are in Philadelphia a month from now, November 5th, we will be talking to Jordan Smith about his book about rum, and also Michelle Craig McDonald about hers about coffee, which again, sort of in both cases, take the story kind of where you're leaving off into the rise of one of the most important products of the sugar revolution is to create rum, and then following that, the rise of coffee as a major commodity in the Caribbean as well. So
Mhm.
sort of moving forward into the 19th century in that way. One thing we didn't get to talk about, and I just want to like just signal to our audience is that one of the things that you emphasize so much in this book is the story of the captives themselves and how they experienced it and what this meant for them. And you have incredible archival material so that you're able to follow families, sometimes through generations, of what you describe as nonlinear captivities, where you see all of these people sort of enslaved, getting away, finding some form of freedom. Their child gets thrown into slavery, like the sort of over time what happens to these people. And we don't have time at the moment to get into any of these stories in depth, but I want to in closing, like offer to let you talk a little bit about why that was so important to you, but also to signal to the audience that you really should run out and get your copy of this book through purchase or through libraries, which are amazing institutions. Uh, to see some of these stories, because it's a really big part of the book that we haven't had enough time to give due attention to. So last sort of closing question, like why was it so important to you to find those stories and craft so much of your narrative around the lived experience of some of these people that you found?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, part of it has an argumentative answer, which is that, in fact, captives themselves shaped a lot of geopolitics in the Caribbean in this period. So when they self-liberated from captivity and gave testimony before Spanish officials, that largely informs many of the raids, the attacks, the Spanish, when Spanish attacked English and French islands, they were usually sailing with strategic information that had been given to them by people who had self-liberated. So in part, like, you actually can't quite understand the geopolitics of this moment unless you center captives themselves and their experiences. And then the other answer to that question is that, this became so in the archive itself, because of the nature of these sources. These are sources that are very different from any other sources, from a lot of other sources that historians of slavery use. These are documents that don't exist because the people writing them down are interested in the institution of slavery. They're interested in the geopolitics of the Caribbean. And so that means that when individuals were interrogated, they were asked where they were from, how long they had been in the Caribbean, what they had witnessed when they had been taken captive, all of the things that happened to them. And these sources become a really rich window into this world of community formation on the one hand, but also real vulnerability and serial dislocation on the other. And I'll just close very quickly with the kind of most upsetting archival find that I had come across was, in fact, a Spanish presidio captain in Providencia who had petitioned the crown to purchase his children. He had had children with an enslaved woman who herself had experienced multiple different kinds of captivity in this moment. And he names his son bears his namesake, and coming across references to the son who later gets taken captive by English traffickers and sold into slavery in Jamaica was really this sort of the kind of sinews of this world started to make a little bit more sense to me, and it made sense to really center those experiences that seemed to be really formative to how people understood, maritime violence in particular in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Casey,
Thank
for
you.
sharing your work with us through this book and in this conversation. It's called The Predatory Sea, Human Trafficking and Captivity in the 17th Century Caribbean. It's just been out for about a month now from UPenn Press, and I urge you to check it out. It is really beautifully written and tremendously informative and provocative. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you all for joining us for this evening of maybe troubling conversation, but I think also really helpful in thinking about the world that we're in and sort of the 17th century, 16th and 17th century origins of a system that then made later developments possible. So
Thank you so much.
thank you. All right. Goodbye, all.